She has many talents, from making electro music to being an MMA journalist. She's the one-girl army behind She Loves the Gloves blog. She's also interviewed many global talents, including the most recent UFC champion Ilia Topuria. She's Dudey! The floor is yours.
Thank you. Good morning. Well, again, welcome to day 2 of Europop Forum. And what better way to start that day than talking about some punches and some kicks? But to be fair, today we're not going to be talking about the punches and kicks per se, as much as about the stories behind them. Or one story in particular, about how yours truly got to travel to New Zealand and interview some of the world's biggest MMA stars. So let's dive into it.
All right, what's up everybody? I'm on top of the Sky Tower here in Auckland, New Zealand with Kristina, all the way from Georgia, doing the sky jump today, jumping 192 meters down to the ground, so nothing crazy. Let's get into it. Here she comes, in 3, 2, 1, go!
Yeah. At about this moment, I realized I fucked up. But to be fair, in all honesty, when you jump from a 200-meter tower and survive, that's pretty much guaranteed to be the highest point of your year, right? And before that, you actually flew into the new year on a plane from Tokyo and spent the first weeks traveling around this beautiful country that no other person that you've met have ever been to. I mean, it's gotta be it, right? Not even close. I'm not gonna complain. Hey, my 2024 started pretty great. Again, 15,000 kilometers. Well, not the other side of the world, but you know, the idea is the same. And then I would spend 26 beautiful, unforgettable days getting the most ridiculous suntan of my entire life. But the best part about this whole experience, it was not the beaches, and it was not the road trips, and not even the skydiving. Believe it or not, but the moments that I will cherish in my heart forever were actually spent at one of Auckland's suburbs in a huge pavilion-like building, which was also an MMA gym called City Kickboxing. And pretty much every MMA fan has heard of this place. It's Israel Adesanya, Alex Volkanovski, Dan Hooker, Kai Kara France. These are just some of the names of UFC stars that came out from this gym and under the tutelage of the great coach and the co-founder of the gym, Eugene Bareman. Both Eugene and CKB were not only named #1 coach and gym of the year for 2 years in a row, but they have single-handedly pretty much changed the landscape of modern MMA with their unconventional approach to fighting, to game planning, to technique. This is all to say that basically to interview the mastermind himself or any of his star students, well, it's an opportunity that anyone working in sports journalism or MMA media, including me, you know, it's an amazing opportunity. Except at that time, I didn't really view myself as an MMA journalist, and none of these interviews were even in my plans. But let's start from the beginning. I discovered MMA in 2017 because of tattoo. So at that time, I used to follow a bunch of tattoo pages on social media, and this guy's picture just kept popping up everywhere. And I am notoriously bad at keeping up with pop culture, so I assumed that he was an actor. I had no idea who he was, and I Googled his name. Conor McGregor, Google search. And the first thing that pops up is this 13-second long video of his knockout of a legendary champion, Jose Aldo. Ever since then, I fell in love with this beautiful sport. And if you take in consideration the time when UFC fights usually air in Georgia, it also means that I haven't slept on a Sunday in about 7 years. There was nothing new about the sport itself because sports has been part of my life ever since I was a kid. I grew up playing sports, watching football, boxing. But there was something different this time. Something about MMA, just, I don't know, it spoke to me like no other sport ever did. And I am 100% convinced that if I discovered it earlier, I probably would be competing professionally. But since I was a little bit late to the party, and that was no longer an option, I settled for the next best thing, which was become a spectator and let it completely take over my life. And when I say take over my life, I mean it. Like every day would begin and end with MMA. News, podcasts, fight breakdowns, fights themselves. And since none of my friends actually care about MMA or know anything about it, I really didn't have anyone to talk about it to. So basically the result of that was that I started writing these blog-like articles on my personal Facebook page, just talking about fights. Not even the fights as much as the fighters and their stories. And then something very strange happened. People who have never watched an MMA fight in their life, people who didn't care about sports in general, not just MMA, they would write to me and they would comment on these posts and tell me that they were reading them and they were actually anticipating more and they wanted to read more just because of the stories, because of the storytelling and the entertainment value because of it. Because it turns out, again, going back to this guy, not many people know how to set up a left cross, but everybody wants to know a story about a boy from Ireland who used to be a plumber and ended up becoming one of the highest paid athletes in the world. And so, yeah, that's how She Loves the Gloves was born. It's a Facebook page, it's a blog dedicated to basically sharing all the knowledge that I've gathered over these years of reading and watching stuff about MMA that would not be available to the Georgian audience because of the language barrier. Most of my content is in Georgian. And pretty much ever since this project began, every spare moment that I've had, every minute before breakfast, during lunch break, after work hours, everything would be dedicated to this. And yes, by the way, this is not my full-time job. I'm actually a copywriter at a creative agency because, well, bills. Yeah, but long story short, I did not travel to New Zealand because of MMA. That trip was 100% just a vacation. And of course, I knew that I would probably stop by because, come on, Georgians don't go to New Zealand. And when else would I get the chance, right? But just the idea and this whole vision of this visit was very different in my head. I thought that I would just, show up, drop off some gifts. I brought some small souvenirs from Georgia. And, if I'm lucky, maybe saw a fighter or two, snap a selfie, and go on my merry way, feeling like I've actually accomplished something. So yeah, and after a couple of days after I arrived to New Zealand, I started to execute my mission. And I was very well prepared, I put on my branded She Loves the Gloves t-shirt, I wrap my gifts, I bring them with me, I show up at the gym, and I miss it all completely. The girl at the front desk, Nat, she tells me that the practice is over and everyone just left 15 minutes ago. And of course, I was crushed. So I tell her that, hey, well, I'm an MMA blogger from Georgia who's traveled all this distance. It's a crazy story. But that's the thing about Kiwis, New Zealanders. They're actually very nice, very helpful. And so we exchanged Instagrams. She takes my Instagram and she tells me that she'll see what she can do. And a couple of days later, I received the magic message that, listen, the team practices at this time. There's no way of knowing who will show up, but you're welcome to pop in. That was all I needed to hear. But at the same time, I realized that, well, I'm already here, so why not try to see if I can talk to someone while I'm there. And you have to understand that until this point in my life, I have never done an interview. But because I've been geeking out about MMA for years, I've watched pretty much every interview that these guys have ever done. And I knew that I had no interest in asking them questions that have already been asked of them before. I wanted to ask something new, So I show up at the gym with this list of questions, pre-prepared, different questions. And I feel like the biggest imposter in the world. But yeah, let's see how it plays out. Let's see if I can talk to someone. Oh, I talked to someone. I actually talked to Eugene Bareman himself. And as you can see here, I talked to him for over an hour. But of course, the moment we start talking, I forget all about the questions that I have, and I just listen and listen, because every sentence that this man is saying is just blowing my mind. Yes, up until this point, I thought that I knew a thing or two about MMA, and realized that, hey, you know nothing, Jon Snow. And so yeah, I just let him talk, and I ask a question or two, like a follow-up maybe. But as he's talking, I am realizing something, is that for all the interviews that I've heard before, some of the things that he's telling me, I've never heard him mention any of this before. And in fact, some of them are on some subjects that are considered quite touchy in the industry. And so at this point, I have red flags and sirens going off in my head. And so I make it very clear to him that I'm an MMA blogger, we're on the record, I'm planning on publishing all this. And he's completely okay with it. But, better be safe than sorry. So actually what I did is, before publishing the article, and as I mentioned, most of my content is in Georgian, I actually translate the whole thing, word for word, how it's printed out. I translate it back to English, publish it on some blogging platform that I've never used before, just as a draft, typos and all, and send it to him. Like, hey, take a look at this, and just let me know if I got anything wrong. Well, I guess I didn't get anything wrong, because he actually let me come back and interview Dan Hooker and Israel Adesanya as well. It wasn't easy. It was a little bit of a wild goose chase, because it took a couple of trips, and I would have to beg my hosts to drive me to the gym, show up early for practice, sit on the gym waiting for someone to show up and see if they would, have the time to talk to me. But in the end, it all worked out better than I could have ever imagined, really. Because in the end, I got 3 amazing interviews with great athletes, great people. We published them all. My street cred among the Georgian MMA fans went through the roof. And of course, I come back home very happy with the trip overall, as well as the job that we did. And of course, I forget all about this article on that blogging platform that is full of typos and that nobody was supposed to see, technically. Until a few weeks later. So one of the MMA journalists that I've been following religiously for years, Luke Thomas, he posted something on his social media about Alex Volkanovski. And as I've said, Alex Volkanovski is one of Eugene's athletes. And we talked about him during the interview. So Luke questioned some information about Alex, and I replied to him in a message like, hey, I've actually heard something similar from his coach when I talked to him a couple of weeks ago, And to prove my point, of course, I linked the article, sent the message, and went to sleep because, let's be honest, first of all, that article was 10 pages long. Nobody will read a 10-page long article from somebody on the internet that they don't know. At least that's what I thought. And at 5 a.m., I wake up to this. Turns out people will read stuff that you send them. Because Luke actually posted my article on Twitter. And for the next 2 weeks, my life is crazy. Because every big MMA news outlet and channel is talking about the interview and just picking it apart word for word. And I get mentioned on podcasts, on some channels that I've been following for years by people that I admire. And I have friends sending me these links and tagging me in stories that, listen, this dude talked about you, and this guy has mentioned you, and this is also cool. And of course, I keep liking it, I keep resharing it. And you'd think I was happy. I wasn't. Because as someone who writes for a living, I understand very well the power that words have, especially when printed, which is why when writing that article, I read and reread and read again every word and every sentence to make sure that every message in that article was communicated the way that it was intended. Because it's one thing when you're sitting and talking with someone and you can pick up on these small emotions and some intonations, and you understand what the person is trying to say. And it's a completely different thing when you're trying to convey all this into a printed format. So yeah, and because I did all this, because I knew how I wrote it all, I could tell that some of the articles and some of the posts, well, let's just say that they were a little bit clickbaity. Of course, not the ones that I've mentioned before. I would never give anyone that kind of attention. But I could understand that people were twisting the words, and they were taking some things out of context, and they would make it seem like the coach was criticizing his athletes or the opposition, and just basically make this whole thing seem more controversial than it really, really was. That did not sit well with me, because I truly believe that while journalists and the media have the responsibility to the audience, we also have a responsibility to the athletes. Sure, we have to ask tough questions. We have to ask for follow-ups. And we have to be objective in how we cover the sport, no matter how we feel about certain things. But at the same time, we need to understand the power that we have. Because a typical MMA fight is 15 minutes long, if it goes full distance. MMA is different from other sports, like take football, take basketball, right? Teams play each other every week, every couple of nights. A fighter will normally fight 2 or 3 times a year. To put things into perspective, that is 30 minutes of spotlight for doing something, for being in the spotlight for something that you're actually doing out of 365 days. And for the rest of that time, people see these athletes the way that they are portrayed in the media, in the interviews, in articles, in quotes. And this is the power that you cannot abuse. Because, listen, I'm not naive. I know how the world works. And I know that every click on that link means $1 in your kid's college fund, right? But at the same time, we need to understand that everything that we put out there, it affects athletes, it affects coaches, it affects lives, really. And this is why it really bothered me that an interview, because again, come on, I've seen clickbait before, right? But it was the first time when something that I done, the interview that was done with me, could negatively impact the relationship between an athlete and a coach. And that was just something that I was not gonna be okay with. Because for as cool as all this attention and congratulations on the job well done was, the most important thing, and the thing that meant the most to me, was being able to just sit on the mats of that gym like a kid at Willy Wonka's chocolate factory and watch these wizards of war create their beautiful, violent magic. The toughest part of my job, I believe, is the fact that I have to talk, sometimes be critical, about people who are 100 times tougher than I will ever be. And the funny part is that most of these people have already achieved much more than I will ever be able to achieve. Okay with it. It's not a job I chose. It's not something that I applied for. It's not something I auditioned for. It's a job that chose me. And frankly, ever since that moment, every day of my life, I've been living a dream that I didn't even know I had. And a friend once told me that it's all about stories. To be fair, he told me many things, but that is the phrase that kind of stuck to me the most, because I really do believe that it is all about stories. But these stories, they need to be told correctly. And listen, jumping off stuff is pretty cool. It's even cooler when you survive. But traveling the world, getting to talk to these athletes, getting to talk to the coaches, see how they feel, see how they think, where they come from, and then having the chance to communicate all this to sports fans, you know, people who love sports, who are passionate about sports, and then at the end of the day, go to bed feeling like you did something well and that you did things the right way. That's a totally different kind of high. And that is something that I would not change for all the clicks in the world. Thank you.